How much do you have towards retirement? Nothing. I came across this term in my late 20s called coercive debt. I probably would be living basically hand to mouth and have to accumulate more debt at times when an emergency arose. And I just think it's absurd that they don't take other factors into calculation when they're determining these numbers. I could die in a car accident tomorrow, and what would retirement matter to me then? I think that a rich, wealthy person is someone who... My name is Rebecca Sanchez. I'm 34 years old, and I'm currently working in the janitorial field as a janitor. Do you have a rent or mortgage? Yes, I do have a rent. I rent an apartment with my husband. The rent is approximately $1,050, and that includes the utilities, and my husband and I basically just split that. Do you have an emergency fund? We take out a certain amount of money from our paychecks for bills, and then whatever is left at the end of the month, when I do my budgeting of all the bills, it goes straight into savings. I'd say I have about $2,500 set aside somewhere. I do have a savings account, with the bank I use a credit union actually, and I'd say there's about $25 in that currently. I'm not really that comfortable with keeping large amounts of money in a bank or institution. I'm slightly paranoid, especially with things that happened in recent events with the hurricanes and everything, and people not being able to access their money because it was all digital and they didn't have anything physically, so they couldn't get anything they needed. I feel safer having more of my money outside of the bank in case something were to happen, something went down, the systems went down. Do you have any debt? I do. I do have student loans. It's around $20,000. But it's currently in forbearance, so I'm not having to deal with that right now. I do have other debts. I do have a credit card debt of around $4,000. What was your worst money decision? Taking out loans, like student loans and things that I didn't actually understand what I was doing, so I was indebting myself. I came across this term in my late 20s called coercive debt. And it's where someone takes on a form of debt at the behest of someone else, coercing them or encouraging them to do so. You're taking on debt, but not of your own accord necessarily. You're being driven by other factors. You're being influenced and coerced in a way. And when I learned about this term, I realized that this is what happened to me when I was a teenager. I was encouraged by everyone around me, from family members and random adults and counselors, to just go to school, just go get in debt, you'll be fine. You'll get a job, it'll pay it all off, it'll be great. This is how it works. And I believed them because I was so young, I didn't have any reason not to, and I was just naive. And at the time, I was dating someone who was several years older than me and happened to have a drug addiction. And he would encourage me to take out the loans as well, and then he would borrow the money from me and tell me he was going to use it to make more money, and then he would pay me back. And that never happened, and I just kept believing it was going to happen. And then I also had my mother telling me I needed to take out all these loans so she could buy a car and do all these things because we were poor. And I just did not understand what I was getting myself into psychologically. And as I got older, I was realized that I was the one left holding the bag, holding the debt. I was the one that was going to have to deal with all the consequences, that this is going to affect me and my finances long term. What is the best piece of financial advice you can give? If you really want to do something that requires you to take out a loan or get into some form of debt, just make sure you have a plan, that you actually understand what you're doing, that you're not just nodding your head and being yeah, it makes sense or whatever, but you don't actually understand how that works fully. My advice would be not to take out loans if you don't need to, and to really understand what that means. I didn't actually understand what that meant, but everyone was telling me it's fine, it'll work out. But I was even though I was 18, I wasn't developed enough cognitively to understand what I was getting myself into, and I did not actually understand what loans like were and how they worked. That's definitely a problem, and that's like one of my regrets, is not actually understanding what I was getting myself into, just because all of the adults around me were basically encouraging me to do so. I make about $40,000 a year gross, like 30 after taxes. My husband also works the same job, same shift as me, so combined we make about 80,000 gross, 60,000 net after taxes. My monthly income is my income plus my husband's combined, and that's approximately $3,580. Our rent every month for our 2-bedroom apartment with utilities included is $1,050. I usually set aside $500 every month for groceries, but sometimes that fluctuates. Sometimes we spend a little bit more than that or a little less depending on the month. But on average, this is what I always set aside for groceries. It's a decent number, I feel like, as long as you're getting a lot of nutritionally solid whole foods and things. I try to do what I can with getting healthier options, but it's hard because of the price of food nowadays has gone up a lot. Every week I spend roughly $40 in gas, just commuting between work and back, and occasionally driving somewhere a little farther away. I put 0 for medical because currently I do not have health insurance, so I'm fortunate enough to not need prescriptions to live, where I don't have any type of illness or disease or health condition where I absolutely have to have this or I might die potentially. I had health insurance most of my life because I grew up poor, so I always had Medicaid. And I had Medicaid pre-COVID and during COVID, but then I got a better job where they started paying me more and I no longer qualified for the Medicaid. Anything offered through my work or through the marketplace is just too expensive for what I'm currently making with all of my overhead and bills. They only take into account what you make and they say, okay, so with that, you should be able to pay this, but they don't take into account how much is your car payment, the car that you need to get to a job to have money to survive to pay your bills. How much is any debt that you have to pay off or your credit score will tank and you'll no longer be able to qualify for anything. I don't consider these things luxuries to be able to pay those. I consider them necessary in order to exist in the current culture that we have. And I just think it's absurd that they don't take other factors into calculation when they're determining these numbers. I put 0 for clothing because I don't have a specific number for clothing, but that doesn't mean that I don't buy clothing during the month. I tend to go to thrift stores a lot. I'd say 25 for subscriptions. I do have Amazon Prime. I also get AAA every month because I feel like that's necessary when you have a car because you never know when something's going to go wrong. But other than that, we're not really big on subscription services. I spend approximately $720 on debt repayment. As I said, I do have student loans, but I'm not currently paying on them, so that's not included in that. I do have a car payment that is around $600, and I also have a credit card that I'm paying off that I pay a little over $100 on every month in order to try and pay it down a bit because that's over what the minimum payment is. I'm just going to say we put roughly $300, but that number again fluctuates. I'm not sure on the specifics because I usually just take whatever's left at the end of the month that we set aside for bills, whatever it goes over, and just put that straight into savings. There's never a time where there's nothing that goes into savings at the end of the month, but it can fluctuate from like 100 to like 400. Said 0 for insurance because again, I do not have health insurance, so I'm currently not paying anything for health insurance. The only insurance I do have is car insurance, and I do not pay that monthly. I pay that every 6 months, and that's roughly around $500 every 6 months. So that is something that comes out of the savings. $0 in investments because I can't really afford to invest in anything. But if I could, I would. Unfortunately, I don't really know that much about investing. I'm just going to put $500 there, and that'll usually go towards if we go eat out or something, or if there's something we need for the household. and I have enough money, or we have enough money to pay for it out of our wallets. I think I do a fairly good job of budgeting based on what we have. I mean, it's a little disappointing when you look at like how much you would be making if you didn't have taxes taken out. You'd be doing a lot better, but I know taxes serve their purpose. I definitely would not be able to afford my lifestyle as it is if I was not married and my husband and I did not combine our incomes. I probably would like be living basically hand to mouth and have to accumulate more debt at times when an emergency arose. It's a little disappointing that I don't feel like we have the financial means to pay for health insurance. I don't think we would have anything for ourselves, and I don't know how we would pay for certain things that came up that were needed. How much do you have towards retirement? Nothing. I'm of a generation and demographic where retirement is something you can't really afford to think about, like in every sense of the word. There is really nothing to spare because there's always going to be some emergency or something that's going to deplete your savings or drastically reduce them. I think that's just what I'm faced with based on my particular financial status, economic level, and the generation I was born into. As far as I'm aware, I don't have any options via my workplace to set aside for retirement. It does scare me that I don't have a resolution currently for what will happen as I age and get towards retirement. I don't really see the benefit in being terrified of something that may never happen. Like, I could die in a car accident tomorrow, and what would retirement matter to me then? I know that it's something I'm going to have to deal with potentially at some point, but I don't see the benefit to my everyday life in living with such anxiety and fear over something that's not entirely my fault. How do you define rich? I think rich can encompass different economic levels and positions. If you took someone off of the street and brought them into the home of your average middle class person, they're probably going to think that they're rich to a degree compared to their own existence. But if you take that same middle class person and put them in like Kim Kardashian's house, they're going to say that that person's rich. I think that a rich, wealthy person is someone who doesn't struggle to make ends meet, but also has enough disposable income that they don't necessarily have to account for it at all times. Their finances are at such a level that they cannot conceive of what it's like for someone else to have to worry and fret about how they're going to exist, how they're going to come up with money for their next meal, how they're going to pay off their debts, whether they're going to lose their house or wherever they're living and what they're going to do if that happens. Finances are a pretty important part of our lives. I mean, we can't really escape them. Our existence depends on them. But I also wouldn't personally define myself by my finances or whatever my occupation is. And I feel like people should be able to properly separate that and not feel too badly if they're in a bad way financially, or if they feel like they're in a hole they can't get out of, or if they feel like they don't make enough. It doesn't make you any less of a person or a human being. We live in a society where things are just kind of built in a way that people can struggle to a degree that they shouldn't necessarily have to. And that's just how it is right now. And we're dealing with it as a culture and a civilization. So don't let that impact your self-esteem and the way you feel about yourself.